The system that built modern society is breaking. For decades, the middle class represented stability. A house, a career, a family, a predictable future. It became the psychological foundation of modern civilization itself. Governments depended on it. Corporations depended on it. Entire economies were built around it. Because the middle class created social order. But something dangerous is happening. Quietly, almost invisibly. The middle class is slowly disappearing, and most people still do not fully understand why. Because this is not simply inflation, or bad economic policy, or temporary instability. This is a structural transformation, a civilization-level shift, and the systems that once created middle-class prosperity may no longer function the same way anymore. The middle class was built during a unique moment in history. Many people assume middle-class life was normal. Historically, it wasn't. The modern middle class expanded aggressively after World War II. Industrial growth exploded. Manufacturing boomed. Wages increased. Housing remained affordable. And one income could often support an entire household. This created something historically rare: mass prosperity. But this system depended on very specific conditions: industrial dominance, stable labor markets, cheap housing, expanding economies, slower globalization. And over time, those conditions began disappearing. Quietly, gradually, then all at once. Globalization changed everything. One of the biggest shifts came from globalization. Corporations realized something important. Labor could become dramatically cheaper overseas. Factories moved. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. Industrial regions collapsed. And millions of middle-class workers lost economic leverage. Because the middle class was heavily built on stable labor power. But globalization weakened labor bargaining dramatically. Workers increasingly competed against global labor markets, outsourcing, automation, cheaper international production, and this changed wage growth permanently. Productivity continued increasing. Corporate profits exploded, but wages stagnated. This created one of the most important economic divides in modern history. The economy kept growing, but ordinary people stopped feeling richer. Housing became a wealth extraction system for previous generations. Housing created stability. Today, housing increasingly creates pressure. Prices exploded. Rent surged. Ownership became difficult. And younger generations began spending enormous portions of income simply trying to survive. This creates a terrifying reality. The middle class increasingly rents life itself. And when housing becomes financially overwhelming, people struggle to save, invest, build wealth, raise families, achieve stability. This weakens the foundation of middle-class existence entirely. Because historically, the middle class depended heavily on asset ownership, especially homes. But once ownership becomes inaccessible, economic mobility weakens dramatically. The cost of existing continues to rise. Modern life became increasingly expensive. Housing, healthcare, education, childcare, insurance, transportation. And while costs exploded, many wages barely kept up. This created permanent financial tension. People work constantly, yet still feel economically fragile. This is one of the defining emotional experiences of the modern middle class. Exhaustion without security. Because modern systems increasingly demand more productivity, more education, more specialization, more work. Simply to maintain lifestyles previous generations achieved far more easily. And over time, this creates psychological instability at mass scale. The digital economy rewarded extremes. The internet changed wealth creation fundamentally. Digital systems scale aggressively, and scalable systems tend to concentrate wealth. This created winner-take-all economies. A small number of people accumulated enormous financial gains through technology, software, platforms, algorithms, scalable infrastructure. Meanwhile, many traditional middle-class careers became vulnerable because digital economies reward leverage, automation, scalability, more than stable labor. This changed capitalism itself. The old economy rewarded steady participation. The new economy increasingly rewards extreme scalability. And most middle-class jobs are not infinitely scalable. Automation is quietly replacing stability. Artificial intelligence may accelerate this dramatically because automation increasingly replaces analysis, customer service, administration, logistics, creative work, technical labor, and middle-class jobs are often the most vulnerable. This creates a terrifying possibility, a future where economic systems require fewer human workers overall. And when labor becomes less necessary, labor loses bargaining power. This changes society fundamentally, because the middle class historically depended on stable employment structures. But automation weakens those structures continuously. The middle class also lost cultural power. The middle class once symbolized aspiration. Now, modern culture increasingly glorifies extremes. Extreme wealth, extreme luxury, extreme visibility. Social media intensified this dramatically because platforms constantly expose people to billionaire lifestyles, luxury consumption, curated success, algorithmically amplified status, and this changes psychology. Ordinary stability begins feeling insufficient, even when historically comfortable. This creates permanent dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction drives consumption aggressively, which creates more financial pressure, which creates more instability. Debt became normalized. Modern economies increasingly depend on debt. Student debt, credit cards, mortgages, car loans, buy now, pay later systems, and debt quietly reshaped middle-class life. Because debt allows people to temporarily maintain lifestyles they cannot fully afford. But over time, debt creates fragility. People become economically dependent on stable income, low interest rates, uninterrupted employment, and once instability appears, the system becomes extremely stressful. Because debt compresses freedom, and financially compressed populations become easier to control economically. The attention economy distracted people from the shift. One of the strangest aspects of middle-class decline is how invisible it became, because modern society is filled with distraction, entertainment, streaming, social media, infinite content. And while attention remained fragmented, structural economic shifts accelerated underneath. Housing became unaffordable. Wealth concentrated aggressively. Labor lost leverage. Automation expanded. But many people remained psychologically distracted from the transformation itself, because exhausted populations rarely analyze systems deeply. They simply try to survive them. The wealth gap exploded. Modern wealth increasingly concentrates among people who own assets, technology, infrastructure, scalable systems. Meanwhile, people relying entirely on labor income struggle to keep up. This creates exponential inequality. Because assets compound, labor usually does not. The wealthy increasingly earn through ownership, investments, automation, scalable platforms. The middle class increasingly survives through time for money exchange, and time scales poorly compared to systems. This is why wealth inequality accelerated so dramatically during the digital era. Social mobility is slowly weakening. The middle class depended heavily on upward mobility, the belief that hard work could improve life. But many younger generations increasingly feel locked out, financially trapped, economically stagnant, even with education, even with full-time employment. And this creates dangerous psychological consequences. Because when populations stop believing systems reward effort fairly, social trust weakens. This is why economic frustration increasingly transforms into anxiety, cynicism, political instability, cultural anger, because the middle class historically stabilized society emotionally. And weakening middle classes often destabilize civilizations historically. AI may create a new economic class system. Artificial intelligence could intensify this divide dramatically because AI amplifies leverage. The people controlling algorithms, automation, scalable infrastructure, digital systems may accumulate enormous economic power, while traditional labor becomes increasingly replaceable. This creates a dangerous future possibility. A society divided between people who own systems, people controlled by systems, and the middle class may shrink continuously between those extremes. The future may belong to ownership. One of the biggest economic shifts happening quietly is that ownership increasingly matters more than labor. Ownership of platforms, assets, intellectual property, automation, scalable systems. Because ownership compounds, labor exhausts. This is why wealthy individuals increasingly focus on equity, investments, leverage, scalability, while middle-class survival often depends on continuous work, and continuous work becomes fragile in automated economies. The disappearance of the middle class may change civilization itself. Throughout modern history, stable middle classes created economic growth, political stability, social cohesion, consumer economies. But weakening middle classes historically create instability because societies become polarized between concentrated wealth, widespread financial pressure, and this may become one of the defining transformations of the 21st century. Not simply technological disruption, but the slow restructuring of the economic pyramid itself. The system is quietly evolving beyond the middle class. The frightening truth is, many systems no longer prioritize broad prosperity the same way they once did. Modern economies increasingly reward scale, automation, digital leverage, ownership, infrastructure control, and these systems naturally concentrate wealth. This does not mean the middle class disappears overnight, but it may slowly weaken over decades, quietly, gradually, then suddenly. Because civilizations rarely collapse instantly, they transform structurally underneath the surface first. And perhaps this is the real reason so many people feel economic anxiety today. Not because they are failing individually, but because the economic systems surrounding them are fundamentally changing. The middle class built modern civilization, but modern civilization may no longer be built to sustain the middle class itself. Subscribe to Wealth OS for more documentaries on wealth, power, AI, and the hidden psychology behind modern society.